this session is going to be focused on the science behind regenerative farming. It's a very ambitious title, but in particular, we would like to discuss what the opportunities we have around some of the plant genetic and animal genetic resources we have to support the transition, a transition that could work for everyone. My name is Mario Caccamo. I'm the CEO of NIAB. NIAB is a research and technology organization that is focused on crop innovation, supporting growers to deliver profitable crops. But this session is actually run jointly with SRUC, and I have a panel here that will take us through some of the key topics that will, focus on this aspect of making use of the resources we have, perhaps that we have not utilized well enough. Now, the format in terms of how we want to run this session is that we will have 5 minutes from every one of the panelists. They will introduce themselves. And after that, we would like to open this for questions and then continue with the discussion. The intention is to get as many questions as we can from you. And as I said, it's so good to see so many of you. It's been a great day. Really enjoyed the day. And it's a good way of ending a fantastic event, the first day of the event. Now, in terms of NIAB, very briefly, we do have a focus on science. That's what we do. And what I mean by science is perhaps can be explained with an example. Now, when people come and tell me, well, no, I do have a new product. This product will increase the wheat yields by 5%. The first reaction will be, really? That's the first reaction. And that's the way we work in science. We want to make sure that those claims can be sustained. We can provide the evidence that will make this a reproducible example that we can replicate, that we can compare information, and we can compare the results from different sites, from different trials. And that's very much how we have been focusing the work we do at NIAB, and equally the work that our colleagues in SRUC take forward. It's really that focus on science. And we really believe that science offers a unique tool to be able to really make those advances faster and with confidence, and making sure they deliver for all of us. Now, I'd like to then pass the microphone to, actually we have 2 microphones, I don't need to pass any microphone, but to Susannah, who you will introduce yourself and give us 5 minutes of your views and how we can use genetic resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel. I'm Susannah Bolton. I'm Vice Principal at SRUC, Scotland's Rural College. We're a fairly unique organisation in that we, as well as carrying out research and having a strong research base, we also are at heart and in principle a college. So we have education and skills development all the way from HND to PhD. We are also a consultants. So we have a strong connection. We have our SAC consultants, who are the largest advisory service in Scotland. So that connection to the industry, that connection to youth and training is really important to us. And actually, it really supports our research base as well. And there's a feedback loop through into both of those things. So I'm going to start by talking about one of the principles of regenerative agriculture, which actually probably is one of the most challenging in terms of the research evidence base that Mario referenced, but also is one of the areas where one can see perhaps some of the greatest potential for improvement, and that's the integration of livestock. So if you go back over 150 years, at that time, farming systems were very much more integrated. In fact, there was a mutual interdependence between the livestock production and the arable production, in that obviously arable was producing feed and that the livestock was producing manure on which that arable production was dependent. Now, around about that time, and those who are familiar with Rothamsted research and the long-term experiments and Broadbalk will know very well that in 1846, we had the very first set of fertilizer trials looking at the potential for inorganic fertilizers in agriculture. And that marked an absolute turning point in terms of what started a divergence between arable production and livestock production. Because with the introduction of inorganic fertilizers, the dependence on livestock for arable production was no longer necessary. So we saw, as the science was developed, as we saw particularly genetic improvement for both crops and livestock, we saw an increasing specialization and increasing divergence, so that those arable crops became better and better and more productive. The productivity increases are phenomenal, but based on a system dependent on inorganic fertilizer. Meanwhile, livestock production, and particularly in the last 50 years, we've seen the benefits, real benefits of genetic improvement in livestock. So in the last 50 years, we've seen milk yields per cow double. And that's largely been on the basis of a focus around genetic improvement. But as we all might also be very aware, and certainly the audience here is very aware, that very often that focus on out-and-out productivity, particularly in isolation, has led to perhaps some unwelcome negative consequences. So one of the things that has really started to happen, particularly in livestock production, so I'll focus very quickly on that, is that we've seen over the last 10 years the introduction of a focus on traits that are not just about productivity. We've seen the introduction of traits that have come through our genetic selection programs. SIUC is a really important part of the genetic selection program that is managed by AHDB through a program called eGenes. We've seen a focus on those traits that benefit calving, that benefit health and welfare, that also have a huge impact, for example, on carbon and the methane reductions associated with livestock. So that's another touch point, isn't it? Methane and livestock. What can we do to improve our livestock production so that methane production is reduced? There is a great deal to go at. There are traits that are now being looked at, particularly linked to the ruminant microbiome, which have huge potential to dramatically reduce methane production. But I'll finish my little introduction here with some thoughts to perhaps tantalize you in terms of some of the real potential for the future. Because actually, what we're now starting to see through the regenerative movement is the reintegration of crops and livestock. And the real potential here is to look at how we can start to match the sorts of traits that we want to see in our livestock to those that would best fit a regenerative system, as opposed to a system that's operating in isolation. So there are all sorts of things that we might wish to explore that at the moment remain unexplored. The other thing that I mentioned was the potential to think about the whole system. Rather than looking at the genetics of the crop or the cattle or the sheep individually, can we look at this as a way of actually starting to think about a whole selection of genetics that we might wish to optimize to deliver the best systems for both environment and productivity? With that, I'll hand over to Lydia.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Susannah. The intention is, of course, to pass to Lydia. I'd like you to think about the questions. I think the point about the integration of livestock into the system, bringing crops, is clearly a very unique, interesting look into the future. Let's keep that in mind. Let's get through all the panelists, and I'm sure the questions we will have, they will apply to all of you equally. And Lydia, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario, and what a perfect introduction to what I wanted to say. So Lydia Smith, head of the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, among other things, and that's what I want to talk about today. So my colleagues have talked indeed this morning about how do you define regenerative agriculture? Incredibly difficult. I've been asked several times as well by visitors. And I think we probably all agreed that it's something to do with the tools that you use, and it's also something to do with the metrics that you take. And you need to do, I think, probably both of those things. So what we're looking to do in the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping is to provide some of those tools. So I couldn't agree more with Susannah about the introduction of livestock. A more complex mixed farming system gives you great potential for greater diversity across the rotation. And I think that a lot of the issues that we have are an incredibly abbreviated rotation made much worse if you have an arable system that's split entirely in the east and a livestock system that's very much in the west. So I've spent some years working on introduction of complex lays, or even slightly more complex lays, into a system, be it a livestock system or indeed an arable system. There's much to be gained from the complexity, the ecosystem services both above and below ground that are given by such a system. And even if you don't have livestock, you can still have those benefits. You can still sell that forage material that you might have introduced into your system. You might only do it for 2 or perhaps 3 years if you really want to make a big difference. And so absolutely, that is one of the tools that I think we can bring to bear. But also, one of the other things, as I said, is measuring it. And so what we're seeking to do within our centre is to measure what is the difference. How far do those roots actually go down? How long are they going to last in the soil? Hey, we've only got a 4-year project that's funded by DEFRA, but it's a really nice start. And there's lots of partners that are working with me in order to achieve that. So we have 4 cropping systems that we're looking at. Perhaps we'll come back to the integration of complex lays into the system. But I think we're talking about species there. I want to go on to one of my other crop areas that we're looking at in the centre, which is fibre crops. So I think it's important in an arable system to have choices. So it may be that it doesn't suit you to have a complex lay, you don't have anything to do with livestock, but let's look at some of the other options. And I think that fibres are a hugely exciting area of interest. And it's a crop, the crops we're talking about here are flax and hemp. Probably hardly any of you, if any of you, have grown hemp or flax, but you've grown linseed probably. They too have great potential for very deep rooting, very different rooting structures, roots of greater longevity, potential to improve the carbon content within the soil, and making no apology for the fact that they need to be able to, at the very least, wet their face. You need to be able to get a proper product from those crops that you can sell in a proper marketplace. And so we're looking to work with industry along the way to not only discover how you grow the crop, we know we can grow it in the UK, and indeed from England right through into Scotland and Wales, but how do we develop the infrastructure around a new cropping set like that? You know, if I was sitting here, I wouldn't, but 100 years ago, great, there were lots of varieties, there was all the infrastructure, there was the processing power, and we let that founder. So now we're back to the beginning. So it's not just about the species. Of course, we would say that at NIAB, we're very much about varietal development. But yeah, we can start with the varieties that are available now, you know, and I can read you the list. We're looking at trialing varieties that have been re-registered just within the last year by our colleagues Elsams, who are one of the partners in the project. So I can say to you, Avion, that's a great flax variety that we know is working. But when that's in the selection stage, but we're some way on the early stage of that journey. We need to go back and start looking at breeding for varieties that will fit those new markets that we're looking at. Because there's the old markets, but there's so many new and exciting ones. And the same is true for hemp. You know, I can say to you that Futura 75 is great and it will grow in a lot of places, will give you lovely biomass. But there is breeding that is needed in that space. We need to look at low THC varieties, for example, that will fit nicely within the requirements of the license. And then different stages, different places on that journey. You can look behind you, not now, but we have 2 biomass crops that have been at a much better stage on that journey. There are many steps down that road already. So miscanthus and willow, there's been some brilliant breeding. There are lots of varieties coming through. There's a fabulous sister project called Biomass Connect where you can look at how those varieties are being developed and look at how they might be able to provide the resources for those new markets. And I think just circling back to where we started, the herbal lays, they're all about the species. And yes, the biodiversity across those species is very exciting, but I think the next step down that journey would be to look at varieties within those species.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lydia. I think the question here is, can we reintroduce that choice and bring products? And for that, we need the market. I think let's come back to that in the question session. I think now we are maybe reducing that choice, but within the species and Phil. Yeah, over to you.
So,
Thank you.
I'm Phil Howell. I work in NIAB's plant genetics department, and I guess the clue is in the name of the department. So we look at the genetics of crops and how we can use those to our advantage. A major theme of our work at NIAB has all been about increasing the diversity, the genetic basis of the crops that we work on. And I've spent a lot of my career so far working on wheat. The reason we need this diversity is that it's the base material from which we can select for improved resilience, and increased resistance, and ultimately reduced reliance on inputs. We need to wean ourselves off these high input crops. It's clearly not a sustainable solution moving forwards. So if we're thinking about diversity then, obviously there's within crop diversity. Can we broaden the genetic base of our crops? So wheat is, the trite message about wheat breeding is you cross the best with the best and you select the best. As you do that, you are narrowing an already narrow gene base. So in terms of its evolutionary history, wheat already starts from a narrow base. So it arose from a chance crossing 10,000 years ago between two different but related grass species in the Near East, and that just used a handful of plants. So there's only the variation in modern wheat that was ever there in that handful of plants. Then there was a further bottleneck of domestication. So the early hunter-gatherers domesticated this new grass species of primitive wheat into something that you could turn into a crop, and that involved selecting certain attributes which made it a crop and not a weed. And then in the couple of millennia since then, there's obviously been the increasing selection, first of all by the farmers who were growing it, and latterly really intense selection with scientific plant breeding. And that's left us with quite a narrow basis of our most globally important crop. And we need to increase that basis. We need to, resistance genes to diseases are constantly under threat from evolving pests and pathogens. We all know of major resistances that suddenly collapse as the fungus overcomes it. So we need to be on the lookout for new sources of things like resistance all the time. Our climate is constantly changing. We need to be looking for new sources of climate resilience. And what we've done at NIAB is we call it a pre-breeding program. We're not releasing finished varieties to perform on farm. We're assembling this diversity in hopefully a UK adapted background, which we can then pass on to the commercial breeders. So my customer isn't the farmer, my customer immediately is the plant breeder. So any lines from my program that he or she takes forward, they would be the parents, or realistically the grandparents of the varieties that make their way on farm. We're still a long way back from the market. And what we're seeking to do is use, in some cases, some of this useful but left behind variation. So these aren't new genes, they're thousands of years old, but they've been stuck in the wild relatives or the close relatives for thousands of years. They might be new to wheat, they might be new to elite wheat. So just through crossing and selection, we're bringing in some of that useful variation. So we like to use the word sort of diversity enriched wheat, bringing in some of these new traits and passing them on to breeders to kind of polish off and get into a form that's suitable for exploitation on farm. So that's one way of increasing diversity within the crop. Another way, of course, is to change the mindset of the crop that you grow. So rather than going down the road of the monoculture, the classic inbred variety, you grow a field of one variety, blends of different varieties or populations of closely related lines with a common genetic structure are finding their way on farm. So the wild farm populations, the Wakelin's YQ population. There are some blends, I believe Cope Seeds are selling as certain formulations. I know a lot of growers are mixing up their own blends. They're buying the straight varieties and making up their own blends on farm. So NIAB have come into this kind of agnostic about blends. We knew that farmers were doing this. It's not just in the UK people are doing it. If you look at the breakdown of wheat varieties in France, by area planted, there is more area of blend planted than the single most popular variety. So this is happening all over the place. So yes, we want to be in a position as a science-based organisation to be able to stand up to our grower stakeholders and say, well, our thinking about blends is X, Y, Z, and these are the reasons why. So we're trying to put them into trials and do what we do. We gather information, we measure yield, we measure disease, we look at gross margins, what were the inputs, what's the yield. The key thing with blends, of course, is you have to be sure that you can sell or use what you're producing. So lots of the major buyers, the millers, will be very sniffy about blends and will not necessarily take blends. Even if they're blends between varieties on their preferred list, they know how the varieties perform well in isolation. They don't necessarily know how they might perform in a blend situation. So please always check that you have a market for your blend before you grow it. In a feed situation, especially if you're feeding on farm, that there's absolutely no reason why I can think of to not look at blends if they help spread the risk and reduce the risk of disease if you miss a spray opportunity and this sort of thing. Then moving on from diversity in that respect, of course, we can diversify the crops that are in our rotations. We were asked by DEFRA a few years ago, along with SRUC actually, they commissioned us to carry out a review of underutilized crops. So the recognition is there that 75% of our arable area in the UK is down to just 3 crops, which is criminal: wheat, barley, and oilseed rape. Obviously the spring and winters within each of those crops, but just 3 species covering 3/4 of our arable land. That's not sustainable in any way over time. So for a whole host of reasons, we need to be diversifying our cropping patterns. So that will improve biodiversity, that will give ecosystem services, we can bring more flowering crops in and help pollinators. It's about the food security arguments for doing it as well. So we have some boards on our NIAB plot which highlight that process, and some of the areas clearly we need more diverse cereals and grains. So we're considering things like perhaps with climate change in the scenario, should we be moving towards durum wheat instead of importing durum to make pasta? Perhaps in the future the climate will be hot enough for us to grow domestic durum in the UK at the expense of feed wheat. We should be considering things like triticale and rye, which have a much lower nitrogen input and are much more tolerant of marginal situations than necessarily growing more feed wheat all the time. We import a huge amount of soya, and we need to be in a position where we can displace some of these imports. And we have some very good legumes that can be protein sources instead. So faba bean is a lot of people grow faba bean, but actually it's underutilized. We don't explore the potential of the faba bean crop to do an awful lot of the things that soybean can do. Soybean is too good, too cheap, and too available. We need to displace that. We're also looking into things like chickpea, lentil, even lupin. So diversifying, instead of just moving from one commodity to the other, we need to consider lots of different options. And we can't just do this in isolation. It can't just be the breeders saying you need to plant this crop instead of wheat, the processors and the end users. There needs to be a market for this, and all the links in the chain need to be in place. So I guess the way forward, I think we need to move. It's about genetics and diversification, but it's also about agronomy. The genetics is only as good as knowing how to grow it and get the most out of it. So this is a plea for more long-term funding into both the genetics and the agronomy, and also to help the supply chain to transition towards perhaps a more diversified output. And in terms of crops, we need to, I mean, alluding to something Susannah said earlier, we need to think, even just within crops, we need to think about performance across the whole rotation rather than the performance of the crop itself. So this is an area where legumes come to the fore. Obviously, there's a fertilizer saving if they're fixing nitrogen within the crop itself, but then there's the legacy they leave to the following crop. So that there's a reduced fertilizer requirement in the following crop as well. So we need to account for that in the way that we plan our rotations moving forwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Clearly, there is a common theme around genetics, and this is now the time for you to bring your questions, bring your comments. The other common theme that probably we didn't agree before assembling the panel that came through today is this need for a market, right? That's clearly something that sometimes is forgotten in all this, and that requires public funding support as well. Now, when it comes to genetics, is not necessarily about new genetics, and that was clear as well from the presentation from the panelists. It's about things that probably have been there for a while, is untapped resources. And I think that's another important point we wanted to stress. You have seen that through these presentations, almost on purpose, we didn't talk about new technologies, and we might come back to that through your questions. It's about what we have out there that we probably haven't used because there was no need, there was not that driver in terms of the demands of collectively the sector. But I'd like to leave it here and open it to your questions. Please raise your hand. There will be a microphone. There's one here. Thank you.
Have you done, or are you thinking of doing any work on perennial cereals?
Yes. So we're now in the third year of the third growing cycle of a crop of a perennial wheatgrass called Kernza, which originates in the prairies in the US. We're interested in, I mean, it grows to about 2 meters tall, 6 feet plus. It produces grains that look like sort of grass seed on steroids, or a bit like wild rice. So they're very long and thin. And having milled some of that and made a homemade loaf with it, it tastes of cinnamon. It's an extraordinary flavor. It's an interesting product. I was contacted a couple of years ago by a student at Heriot-Watt who was doing a master's, who wanted to see if I could spare any for him to make whiskey out of. I know that in the US they make beer out of it as well. So it's an interesting prospect. The yield is far from competitive. So after year one, I had to triple check my working. The yield was something like 80 kilos of grain per hectare. So that's barely harvesting more than we planted in the first place, which is not a sustainable way to grow a crop. In year two, things had changed massively. So this is with no fertilizer at all, no inputs. The only input was a broadleaf herbicide in the first year, just to get the plots established. We have huge weed pressure on our trials ground at NIAB, so we did need to look after it in the first year. But at the end of year two, it just crept above 1 ton a hectare, which is now starting to be sensible. Looking at results from around the world, they typically see it peak in years 2 to 3, so we might see somewhere around that this year and then expect it to decline. But in the US, they grow it for grain, but they graze it over winter, so they use it as a forage crop over winter. And the big beauty about the crop is it grows 6 feet tall, but it also grows 6 feet down. So there are some fantastic pictures. If you ever Google Kernza on the internet, there's some pictures of an American man at the bottom of a soil pit. He has a really, really impressive long beard. But even more impressive than that is the depth of the root system. So it goes down almost 3 meters. So that's something that we're interested in trying to quantify in Lydia's carbon cropping project. So we're trying to quantify exactly how much carbon is captured by the root. So we intend that the crop is in place for 5 years. We'll carry on taking it to yield for 5 years and see what happens. So we're halfway through a 5-year cropping with that.
So yeah, I was just going to add a little tiny bit to that. So Phil and I went to sample because It's amazing how many crops people know nothing about what's going on the ground. Obviously potatoes and carrots and whatnot. But I think a project that we did about 6 or 7 years ago on wheat root idiotypes. And hardly any of the breeders knew anything about what the roots looked like. So the first thing that we did was to dig up Phil's canwe wheat, and the root ball on it was unbelievable for something that had only been in the soil for a couple of years. And so, yeah, it might not be a crop that is massively profitable quite yet. It's a very, very early on that journey that I was talking about. However, even if we were putting it in as a purely soil improving crop, I think that it would be difficult to beat compared to some of the others that we looked at.
Well, we're waiting for, there's a question here about if we can bring the microphone. One quick question to Susannah. Just one point you mentioned in your introduction is, of course, what we have here in this panel is the fact that we have crops and animals. And it's something which we haven't seen probably as much as we want to. It's one of the principles, a part of the principles of region farming. Do you want to comment more on that? Because you left it just at the end of your introduction, while we get more questions.
So just while we're waiting for the next question, one of the things that I'm delighted Phil mentioned was the potential for mixtures, and also thinking about the ways in which we can produce forage crops that are perhaps more specifically suited. If you actually look at the genetic potential, if you take a measure like carbon, the potential for carbon reduction, with improving the genetics alone, we can actually reduce carbon in our production systems by around 30% potentially, by improving things like the efficiency with which those animals digest and grow as a result of the feed. If you look at the amount that you could reduce carbon by feed additives, or by using plants that actually also work with that microbiome environment to reduce carbon, the potential, you're looking at something at similar levels potentially when you're looking at the potential for certain additives or plant products. So actually combining the two and looking at that as a system, the way in which you can optimize your forage crops, the way you can optimize your mixtures, alongside the livestock genetics, you have something where you potentially have such a real synergy in terms of optimizing performance. So it's really exciting, actually, to be part of a regenerative movement which is thinking about those things. And of course, the quid pro quo, if you like, is the vital importance of a manure production system back into your crops. And I'm delighted my colleague Christine Watson is here, really thinking about the way in which that nitrogen cycle, which is actually underpinning such a lot of this, it is so important in terms of the way in which the soil is also improved, the fertility, the ways in which nutrients, not just nitrogen, but the other vital nutrients, phosphates and potassium, are also made more available as a result. And we at RUC have some research that is demonstrating that in terms of the value of the manure alone alongside the animal systems as well.
Oh, thank you, Susannah. This point about systems is clearly something we might want to discuss later again. There's a question here, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So as I understand it, regenerative agriculture is still quite a niche sort of part of the farming sector. So I was wondering what drove your sort of investment in this kind of area. Is it farmer demand led, or is it government target, international target led, or is it seeing the writing on the wall and thinking this is the way that farming's got to go? And I wondered what you perceive the trajectory of in terms of future investment in plant breeding and animal breeding, in terms of will it become the dominant or exclusive way of looking at plant breeding and agriculture in the future?
Is it pull? Is it push? I think that who wants to start? I think it's a question for all of you.
Shall I start?
Lydia first, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting one, and I think there's probably a lot of farmers that would consider themselves purely conventional, who've been on that road towards regenerative farming for some time. Perhaps they don't like the term, or they're unsure what it means. But I think that there are principles of improving soil health and the delivery through the soil of a good crop that probably any farmer here has been doing, and if they're not doing it, will begin to run aground. And so I wouldn't like to call it niche or exclusive, actually. I would not necessarily agree with that as a description. In terms of some of the specific work that I've been doing over the last few years and going forward with my, as I said, DEFRA-funded project. So yes, we've been doing a lot of work. We knew that there was a need for strategies that would improve soil structure, health and delivery, and the soil microbial community, and all the things around nutrient cycling and porosity and so on. We needed to find a route towards that, and DEFRA said, what do you suggest that we can do that will address those components that are contributing to climate change? And we said, well, we'll address carbon capture, because that embraces all of those things in a way. We want to look at broadening out the rotation. We want to look at carbon capture into soil organic matter, which intrinsically is going to help with soil structure and health, but also to drive something which DEFRA is, again, also very keen on, that you have a sustainable, productive system that will give returns to farmers and want them to carry on.
Susannah, you want to?
So I think it is a very interesting question. Thank you for it. I think one of the things that we've started to see, certainly on the livestock breeding side of things, is a very strong demand for those traits, particularly associated with livestock health and welfare, associated with a reduction in methane production, many of which are also very aligned with the sort of traits that we think would be very important in regenerative systems. I think actually I'm going to call my colleague Christine in as well, just to quickly add to this, because Christine has been in receipt of some really important grants associated with some of this, not least actually the associated with the introduction of legumes and other things, which actually also might give an indicator of where we're seeing that demand coming from, which is so important.
Thanks, Susannah. I'm Christine Watson from SRUC. It's a great question, because I think there's a large number of answers to it, and I think there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this. There's no one recipe for getting this right. But I think, for me, one of the drivers is climate change, actually. And is the need to be able to adapt to changing soil conditions, changing weather conditions. And it's that adaptation. Something's gone wrong. What's wrong with my system? And I think we see a huge drive and huge innovation from the farming community, looking for, what is it I can do that is going to prevent this soil loss in the future, or is going to give me a better integrated system that gives me livestock health whilst getting all the other things that I want. So I think there's a real range of drivers. Yes, absolutely, net zero is a driver, and if there are things that we can solve more easily through genetics, then we should do that. But it's always going to be a combination of genetics and agronomy.
Mario, can I just add one more thing, which is, it was very interesting this morning. I don't know whether any of you attended the evidence session that Rothamsted Research chaired earlier today, but they were looking at the evidence for the benefits of regenerative agriculture. And the one thing that comes through strongly, because actually short-term benefits are really hard to identify, but the one thing that comes through really strongly in the data that they've analyzed, and that there were huge amounts of data and understanding from all over the world, the one thing that comes through is actually the benefit. There is clear benefit in terms of the long-term resilience of your production system. whatever that might be. And I think increasingly, because of climate change and because of the ways in which we are so much at the mercy of weather events, we're also at the mercy of the market. Building in that resilience right from the beginning by having a greater diversity within your system feels to me like one of the things that there's a much wider acceptance of that and a much stronger demand for the need for that as we go forward.
I think that question was very good as well, because in a way it defines where SRUC and NIAB sits in terms of the innovation pipeline. We are applied scientists and we respond to challenges, and I think that's another way of answering your question. Thank you for that. There's another question here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Hans from Norway. I'm doing a relatively small sheep farm in British. I have a 300 sheep farm in Norway. So I have two questions. One for Phil. You're talking about this crop going with 3-meter roots. Is this a type of wheat, or I didn't get what crop it was?
Yeah. So the scientific name is it's Thinopyrum elongatum. It's called intermediate wheatgrass. So it's a perennial grass species that actually an institution called the Land Institute in Kansas have been working on. They're interested in perennial crops, so they've been working on kind of re-domesticating this wild species and seeing how you can turn it into a valuable crop. They're looking at I think perennial sunflowers and things as well. They're interested in the whole idea of perennial crops and the soil conservation that's inherent in that. If you're not disturbing the soil every year to plant your new crop, inherently that's saving more carbon. So.
My next question is for Susannah with the methane on livestock. I do have a breeding flock, so we start now in Norway introducing and measuring methane from the sheep and doing genomics testing and try to implement this in the breeding system. That's the Norwegian Farmer Sheep Association deliver. But I also see a science from Tyskit with Dominica Kroll doing a test on additives added to feed. That is difficult to have additives that both reduce methane and anomia at the same time. She presented some, the research is not finished, but she presented some results with that names during a signpost program this winter. What is your take on this? Is it best to reduce methane through genetics or additives?
Thank you very much. A very interesting and difficult question. Although I think I know the answer that I will give, and it's a personal answer rather than an SRUC answer. I actually think the potential for both is great. At SRUC, we have some wonderful facility at our Easter Howgate farm, just north of Edinburgh, where we are able to test the individual animals within a closed and enclosed system to look at the potential for genetics, but also to look at the potential for additives. I think as we think about the ways in which we're looking for that longer term resilience and that longer term capacity for improvement over time, I think we have to look at the genetics. We have to look at the size of the animals, the efficiency of the animals. We have to look at the way in which their rumen operates. Looking at additives alone, without understanding the genetics, I feel like we're really missing a trick. So I think additives could and should have an important role, but I actually don't like the term additives. I actually think we should be talking about feed. And we should be talking about how we diversify our feed options in order to optimize them. So I think that's the way that I would like to think about it in relation to that really interesting interaction between the animal, and the crops that we're growing to feed them, rather than thinking about there's something we might be able to add that will be the solution.
Lydia.
So Phil always jokes that I'm able to bring Sandpoint into almost any session, no matter how difficult. But I completely agree with Susannah. Feed, I think, is very much more interesting and important and a potential route than additives. And we know that from work I've been doing for the last decade that those crops with high molecular weight complex tannins will significantly reduce the methane output of ruminant animals, be they sheep or cows or goats or whatever. And we have measured this. Sandpoint is the queen of reduction of methane outputs, but Birdsfoot, Trefoil and others have quite a strong input. And this is some of the components of these complex lays that we see. So they are already there, and a route to that outcome.
Very, very good point, and I think I lost a bet about your mentioning something. Anyway, but I think that question opens the door for the question I would like to take last. I mean, there is another question coming from that, but just for you to think about, which is, what's the role of new technologies in all this? I think it would be wrong not to touch on this before we leave, but just think about that. But let's take another question from the back there.
Hi. This is a question for Lydia. I was really interested in what you were saying about the flax and hemp trials because I'm working on a research project at the moment developing flax and hemp processing machinery to turn it into yarn. So I was just wondering, is there a way that I could link up with the farmers you're working with who are trialing the crops, because I have a processing equipment for them potentially?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question because the difficulty of introducing these underutilized crops back into the rotation is quite often about both pre-farm gate and post-farm gate processing, and that's certainly absolutely the case with these fiber crops. So I wouldn't recommend that you would all rush off and plant those crops without having a good look at where your nearby processing is. So they are building up, and because the marketplace has hotted up, and I would suggest that if you go down to the poster which talks about the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, there's a nest of products sitting underneath it, which are all composed of hemp products, be it fibre or shiv, the fibre being the outside and the shiv the central core of the stem. But in order to get to those products, there's quite a few steps. And so you cut the crop, you have to ret it, which is an Old English word for rot it, really. You have to do something to break those sugar bonds between the fibres in order to allow them to break open and be used as a fibre. And then there's a process, as you're alluding to, for both flax and hemp. Both of them have to be retted, of course, to then take it to the next stage, separate them out, comb out the materials. And there's very good processing now in southern Scotland, and there's a real hot spot in Yorkshire. There's the Yorkshire Hemp Company and also Harrison Spink. They've both got very big processing. And there's a scrutching plant that's going to be built within the next year, we hope, for flax. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space, and absolutely come and engage with us and join our interested parties. You can sign up to www.carboncapturecropping.com and you can receive the newsletters, and we'll keep you abreast of developments as they occur.
Thank you. One of the great things of Groundswell that you almost always run out of time before you run out of questions. But we have another question here, I think probably the last one, and of course the very last one will be about technologies. But please.
We just discussed how important livestock is in regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of people going vegan to save the planet. How do we better get the message across to the public, or whose responsibility is it? Should it be like the government or AHDB, or who should be, how do we do it better, or how do we get the message out?
Who wants to start with that? I think, yeah.
I will have a go at this. I think there are several angles that are really important, and perhaps the most important one is that when we're talking about agriculture, predominantly, and the sort of agriculture we're talking about food. And food is incredibly important to the world, and nutritional security is really important to the world. What we perhaps need to be thinking about, as opposed to meat eaters versus vegan, is thinking about sustainable protein. And actually, how do we develop systems that enable sustainable protein most effectively? And I think rather than trying to create a divisive argument, if everybody can actually think about those things that are really important in delivering really wholesome nutrition, not just here or in Europe, but across the world, that challenge around producing protein sustainably is one of the ones that comes through most strongly. And at the moment, those systems, integrated systems, the capacity to utilize the amazing potential of livestock to break down non-digestible bits of plant and turn it into meat that is eminently digestible and eminently nutritious is a really important part of those sustainable diets. So I think talking about sustainable diets perhaps is the way that we need to do it.
Thank you. And before we end the session, I wanted to touch on the new technologies. I think it's something that sometimes could be considered controversial, but from my perspective, is one of the tools that we should have in our toolkit. But I wanted to hear from you in terms of how you see this in the perspective of the discussion we had today. And can I start with you, Phil? Thank you.
Yes, I thought you'd start with me. So my perspective is that we're faced with some extraordinary challenges moving ahead for food security, nutritional security, as we've heard, and we will need literally every tool in the box that's available. I have always viewed some of the genetic technologies as being part of a continuum of technologies that are available to plant breeders. Obviously, some of these have had kickback from consumer and environmental groups. Some of the new gene editing technologies, the law has changed in England at least within the last year, which nobody's tested it yet, but in theory, some of the new gene editing technologies would be permissible for light touch field testing, and we've done some of that light touch field testing ourselves. While we're evaluating the material, it can't go into the food chain. That's then a separate argument. The Food Standards Agency are evaluating material and their criteria for allowing the marketing. So that there's a food safety angle, which is separate. There's an environmental safety angle. I honestly don't believe there's a case to answer there. I think some of these technologies, the products that will be in your fields or on your plates will be indistinguishable from products which have arisen through conventional breeding and approaches that are allowable for conventional breeding. And if this is a way to make those happen more effectively, and even to answer some questions that conventional breeding can't address, then I say bring it on. I think we should embrace these technologies responsibly, of course, but embrace them and take them forwards. We should use them to our advantage.
Thank you, Phil. Lydia.
So I'll steer clear. I think you've done a beautiful job of addressing that. I don't know whether you would call it new technology, but I'm going to push my luck and mention Sandpoint a second time because it's quite a useful one to talk about. So probably a lot of you don't even know what it looks like. It's a forage legume, grows quite tall, and used to be grown a lot, particularly in the east of England because it has such good soil improving qualities. But you call it an orphan crop because it got replaced in high input, more conventional agriculture by crops like red clover and others, lucerne, I guess, to an extent, even though it doesn't have the wonderful qualities I was talking about, reduction in methane outputs. But in terms of if you want to improve an orphan crop like that, about which nothing is known, there's no breeding history, we now have the ability to go for a full genome approach to get a real feel for what you've got in the pool, what the breeder's pool is, and which of those characters that might be interesting to you you can address, and you can associate characters with that genetic search, and so you can get a lot more quickly to where you want to go. And to use an example of another crop that Phil and I again worked on together, called Buglosoides, which has a very interesting stearidonic acid oil content. It's now being grown by a number of specialist farmers and going into probiotic oils, let's call it. But we ran into all sorts of problems. We were when we were converting it from a weed to a crop, and it was only through a genome study early on that we were able to see that we had a very narrow pool, and we needed to access quite quickly much more diversity. So we went back to the Centre of Diversity and quite quickly came to the point where we have a decent viable crop. So it's not super new technology, but it's affordable now. And I remember Ian Mackay, dearly departed, our statistical geneticist at NIAB, saying, I'll put the magic population together. We can't afford to do it now, but guarantee in 10 years we will be able to afford to do this for some of these lines that are coming out of this pre-breeding.
So I realise we've run out of time, so I'm going to just throw something in that I think is really important in relation to the commentary we've had about increasing diversity across the board. Actually, Phil mentioned that one of the reasons why we have such a narrow genetic base in our current wheat varieties is that that's largely driven by the demands of the processors. So if we really want to capitalise on the benefits of increasing genetic diversity across crops and livestock, the introduction of new crops and novel crops into our systems, we need to invest in really innovative processing technologies in order to create the demand, to drive that market for those products in a much more effective way.
Thank you very much. That's it. I think we are running out of time. As you said, we probably are out of time. I would like to just end by saying thank you, thanks to the panel. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.